verses 21 through 24. Again, that's Amos chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs, the melody of your harps, I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Thank you, Kenny, and thank you, Caleb, for leading us in our singing this morning. Get my mic turned on here. All right. One of the first things, I want you to imagine a scenario where a visitor walks into, my mic's not on, I'm getting a lot of head shakes. Sounds like it's on. Okay. I don't know. Well, I'm going to talk loud and hopefully y'all can hear me. One of the first things that a visitor will probably notice, they walk into the Church of Christ for the first time, having never worshiped with one before. Well, I hope the first thing they notice is how friendly and how welcoming and loving that the members of the church are. But the first thing that they will notice probably when worship begins, assuming they have some background in other worshiping with other groups, is they will notice, hey, the singing here it's a cappella. Or, in other words, that they just sing. They don't have any instruments that accompany their singing. And one of the questions that may come to their mind, and it's a fair question for them to ask, is the question, why? You know, for those of us who have maybe been members of the Church of Christ for a long time, or I was raised in the church, hey, I don't think twice about it. You know, when I picture worship happening in my mind, I just envision a cappella singing, but that's not the case for everybody. And so a fair question to be asked is, why is that the case? Is there solid biblical reasoning for it to be the case? Because if there's not solid biblical reasoning, then it's something that we ought not to be doing. We might need to change what we are doing. And so I want to talk about that topic that it's caused some debate and caused some divide in the history of the church, very sadly. But it's a topic that's not necessarily to be avoided. And so we're going to be looking at instrumental music and worship today. Today is the first Sunday of the month, and so as you can see on the slides, that also means it is Fundamental Sunday. We have already talked about worship on one of our Fundamental Sundays, but we're going to get more specific this morning when thinking about our music and our singing within our worship service. So what do we need to know about instrumental music and worship? Here's how I'm going to work through this sermon. I've got 3 points. They're more like sections, though. All right, 3 sections. Section 1 is instrumental music and the Old Testament. Section 2, instrumental music and the New Testament. And then section 3 is obedient worship. And so that's how we're going to progress through this. You know, most of my sermons, y'all have probably noticed, I have a main text and we kind of just work out of that main text. This is going to be different. We're going to go several different places this morning to try and accomplish what we need to get an idea of what the Bible makes clear on this. So let's think first about instrumental music and the Old Testament. Here's a question for you. You don't have to answer it, but it's a question to give to you. Did God authorize instrumental music to be used in worship to Him under the Old Covenant? If I go to the book of Psalms, how many Psalms will talk about the use of instruments in worship to God? Right? But did God authorize it? Did He ever command or validate it? You know, there have been some well-intentioned brethren over the years, brethren that I respect and love, who have tried to, in their endeavor to try and be faithful in their worship now, have tried to make the argument that God never authorized instruments in worship. I don't believe that to be the case. One of the passages that is often brought forth is the one that Kenny read for us from Amos chapter 5. You can look at verses 21 through 27 there, specifically verses 21 through 24. In verse 23, it says, "Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps." I've heard that passage used to talk about instruments in New Testament worship. A couple problems with that. The first one is that that's an Old Testament passage, so you can't apply it to New Testament worship. The second problem with it is that the problem there is not the instruments. It's not the music that's being put forth. The problem in that passage, as Kenny read for us, is hypocritical worship. Now, they are offering sacrifices. They were offering musical worship to God, and yet there was no justice. There was no righteousness in the land. And so in verse 24, as Kenny read for us, he'll say that let righteousness and justice flow like a stream. That is what God wants. So that's the problem really in Amos 5, and it doesn't really apply to instrumental music at all. But I wanted to bring it up because so many people have, and I believe it has been misused historically at some points in the Lord's church. Now, passage that's particularly important for this is 2 Chronicles chapter 29. I'm going to ask you to turn there with me. 2 Chronicles chapter 29, specifically looking at verses 25 through 28. It is my understanding of this passage, the 2 Chronicles 29 will show us that in the worship of the Old Testament, God authorized instruments to be used. Here's what we read, verse 25. "And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres," aka instruments, "according to the commandment of David and of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet, for the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. And then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began also, and the trumpets accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. And the whole assembly worshipped. And the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded, and all this continued until the burnt offering was finished." What is happening in this passage of 2 Chronicles 29? They are worshiping, right? They're offering sacrifices to God, a burnt offering. And verse 28 talks about the whole assembly worshiping together, and at the same time the singers sang, the trumpeters sounded. In other words, the instruments were played along with the singing. Now, verse 25 is of specific importance. Whose commandment was it that they were obeying when they stationed the Levites with instruments? It says, according to the commandment of David and the commandment of Gad the king's seer and of Nathan the prophet. But all those very important men, two of them, but guess what? They're just men. That's not nearly as important as the last part of the verse. Last part of the verse says, "For the commandment was from where?" It's from the Lord through his prophets. Right? And so this passage shows us that in Old Testament worship, specifically here in this instance, we see that it was the commandment of God for these instruments to be set up and used the way that they were. And so I don't think it is much of a question personally. I think it's very clear that God not only tolerated, but actually authorized and commanded instruments to be used in his worship in the Old Testament. The question that is very important for us is, can it be carried over to New Testament Christian worship? Because you and I, we're not under the Old Covenant, under the law of Moses anymore. We know that there are many things that were commanded and authorized under the Old Covenant that aren't authorized or commanded anymore. For instance, right, we are at worship today. I have not seen anyone offer an animal sacrifice since we've got here. But yeah, that was a common part of worship in the Old Testament. Why do we do that? Well, in Hebrews 7, we read this: "He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself." In other words, Christ is the sacrifice, right? He is the sacrifice once for all people, once for all time. So that's not carried over it was authorized, it was commanded in the Old Testament. It's not commanded or authorized in the New Testament. It's not carried over. And so now the question goes back to instrumental music in the New Testament. Was that something that was carried over? So we've got to think about instrumental music and God's new covenant. What we're going to do here is I'm going to offer you, there are 3 passages in the New Testament that concern corporate singing, or singing or music offered in worship to God in corporate Christian worship. Right? There are some other passages that mention singing, like Paul and Silas singing in a jail cell. Right? That's not what I'm trying to get at here. I'm talking about when the people of God are actually assembled together for the purpose of worship. What are the passages that talk about? There are 3 of them that I know of. The first one is 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 15. What is the outcome then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the mind also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the mind also. Now, what's happening in 1 Corinthians 14 is we are looking, if you look at the rest of the context of the chapter, it is talking about when the people of God are assembled together. And specifically, the topic of the chapter is how to handle miraculous gifts whenever they're happening in a first century worship service. Specifically, speaking in tongues, for instance. What this passage is getting at is that if someone has the gift of tongues, they can pray with that gift, they can sing with that gift, but the rest of the chapter makes it clear that's only to be done if there's an interpreter. And so there are some ways where this passage isn't as applicable today in the same ways that it was to the first century Christians. So what do we learn for it as regarding our worship today? Well, prayer and singing are both things that we still do in worship, things that are commanded elsewhere in worship. We'll also notice, just for the sake of noticing, that while it mentions singing, it does not mention that it is to be accompanied by anything else. It just talks about singing. And of course, that's important because we're establishing a pattern. So let's move on. Ephesians chapter 5, a little bit more well-known verse. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. How do I know that this is in the context of an assembled group of God's people? Because they speak to one another. Okay? You do that when other people are present with you. So this is in the context of worship setting. And of course, we read that you speak to one another psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing. So there's our word that we do every Sunday morning. We are commanded to sing. We are also commanded in this passage to do so to one another, and we're also commanded that it should be done with the heart. The heart is to be involved when we make melody to God. One of the ways that this is sometimes presented is that if there is an instrument, the instrument that is to be used when you sing is the instrument of your heart. In other words, you don't make melody with the harp or the lyre or the trumpet. You make the melody with your heart. I think that's an appropriate way to read it, and that is what we are commanded to do in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. And of course, once again, we do not see a mention of instrumental music. We only see the mention of singing. And there's one other one. And it's Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell within you, richly dwell within you, with all wisdom and teaching, and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Again, how do we know that this is in an assembly? Teaching and admonishing one another. Okay, so we're again in a group of people. Also, we are commanded once again to sing, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And we are commanded, notice that in both of these last two passages, we are commanded to sing with the right kind of heart. I find that interesting. There's not a lot of passages in the New Testament that talk about singing as a corporate body, but 2 of the 3 specifically mention making sure you sing with the right type of heart. Okay? Sing with the right heart. Last one, now we sing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. That is the disposition of our heart in song. It's to be in the right place. One of those places it should be is a place of gratitude and thankfulness. And of course, once again, is there a mention of instruments? There's not. It just mentions singing. So let's summarize all that. We look at those three passages. Let's bring them together in summary. In the assembly of the Lord's church, we found out we are to sing. We are to sing with the heart. We are to have a thankful heart as we sing. We are to speak to one another through song in order to teach and admonish. That's what we've learned so far about music in New Testament worship. That is what we are commanded to do, and that is what we have authority to do as Christians. So while it is the case that God authorized the use of instrumental music in the Old Testament, we do not see it carried over with the authority in the New Testament. I'll give you a couple just for your information things. It is, based on my research, the best indicator I can say is that there weren't any instruments used in Christian worship until much later than the first century. Somewhere about 500 years after seems to be a general consensus. There are some who will even place it in the 7th century with Pope Vitalian and the Catholic Church. And so you have this dynamic where for hundreds of years, the New Testament Christians worship in music strictly through singing with their voices. Here's the point that I am trying to make, and I think this is an important point. If the first converts to Christianity were Jews, right? Many of the Christians we read about in the New Testament are Jewish people. And so they move from their faith in Judaism to their faith regarding Christ, become Christians, and they continue to worship God. And into the Old Covenant, they had both the authority and the knowledge of how to use instruments as they worshiped God. So when they became Christians, why didn't they carry over that knowledge? Why didn't they continue to use a harp, the lyre, the trumpet? They certainly knew how to do it, I'm sure. Why did it take 500 years for it to creep into Christian worship? To me, the only logical answer is that they didn't do it because they didn't think that God wanted them to do it. They thought it was better not to. And so that's something to take with you. All right. Now, someone here is going to say, okay, I understand your point, but while the New Testament doesn't command us to play instruments in worship, it also doesn't tell us not to. And we didn't see that in any of those passages. We didn't see it authorized, but it didn't specifically say, don't do it. And so that is where we need to understand what is sometimes referred to as the law of exclusion, which is simply this. If God tells us what to do and how to do it, it excludes every other way of doing it. Okay? There's not enough, this Bible, my Bible is fairly thick, but there's not enough paper in the world for God to list every way we aren't to do something. Right? If your parent gives you a task to do something in the house, it is impossible for that parent to tell you every way you aren't supposed to do it. What they'll probably do is tell you how to do it and then just expect you to follow the pattern or the example that they gave you. And I would suggest that's what God expects us to do as well. An example of this might also be if you have your mother send you to the store and says, I need you to go pick up some eggs. Here's a $50, well, eggs might be $50 now. No, not quite. But he said, here's a $50 bill. Go to the store and get some eggs. And you take the $50, you go to the store, and you bring back the eggs. And your mom also tells you, hey, bring me the change afterwards. So you come home, here's the eggs. You're going to give the change to your mom. The problem is you hand her back $5 of change. Did eggs really cost $45? They're expensive. They don't cost $45 for a dozen yet, right? So what happened? Well, also while I was at the store, I bought some ice cream, and I was on the way home and I got a little thirsty, so I went and I had some lunch, And then, you know what, I saw somebody else that I knew, one of my friends were in town, and I said, hey, come over here, I'll buy your lunch. So I spent the rest of the $45 doing that. How's your mom going to feel about that? Did you do what you were authorized to do? Sorta, right? You did it, but you threw in a bunch of other stuff you weren't authorized to do as well. My mother would not have been happy that I lost the approximately $40 or whatever it would have been in the change. The point is, when you have an explicit command and instructions on how to do something, the other things that you can do, other ways of doing it, are just excluded. You don't have to have them explained to you. And so if God says something like, I want you to sing to me, teaching and admonishing one another, and sing with thankfulness in your hearts to God, well, that's what we're authorized to do. Every other way of doing it is excluded. God doesn't have to explain all of those things to us. Which brings us to the last section, which is understanding obedient worship. God desires obedient worship. That is a consistent theme throughout the New Testament. I don't know if you have noticed this as we have made our study through Hosea, that there are many times in the book of Hosea where the people are offering some semblance of worship to God, and God is saying the same thing he did in that Amos passage that Kenny read for us. Yeah, you're offering some type of worship, but I'm not accepting it. Why not? It wasn't as he authorized. It wasn't obedient, truthful worship. In Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, you have the account of Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. Y'all remember that story? They're both priests, and they go to offer sacrifice, go to burn incense to God. And God had told them specifically, whenever you go to do this, you ever go to burn incense, there's a specific place you need to get the fire. Right? And they decided, well, any fire is as good as another fire, right? And kind of like Naaman, when he needed to be cleansed, he's like, the rivers at home are just as good as the Jordan, right? That's not what God commanded. So Nadab and Abihu, they took the fire from a strange place, and God ended up consuming them with fire, taking their life in that moment. And then 1 Samuel 15:22, you have the account of Saul and Samuel. And you have the account where Saul is told to go and to destroy the people that they are fighting against, and to destroy them completely. Don't take any of the livestock, nothing. I want it all destroyed. And Saul and the people, they saved some of the livestock. And what did Saul say? Well, first said, well, the people made me do it. The second thing he said was, well, we're going to use these things to offer sacrifice to God. So God said to destroy it, but we held them back, and then we're going to use them for sacrifices. And Samuel told him in 1 Samuel 15:22, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and heed than the fat of rams. To obey is better than to sacrifice. God values obedience more than worship, and he values worship a lot. He just values obedient worship. And then John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, Jesus is having a conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, and she's wondering, where do we need to worship? That's a pretty important question, right? Your people say you need to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. My people say we need to worship at this mountain. Well, which one's acceptable before God? And Jesus told her, an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Must worship. You think God desires worship? Yes. You know what he really desires is obedience worship. Worship that is in a line with his truth. I want to be one of those true worshipers that Christ talked about. One that worships the way the Father said we must. And in order to do that, I believe we ought to worship in ways that are both commanded and authorized by God. And that is why when we give our worship to God, we sing a cappella, and we don't include instruments in our worship. You know, as Christians, it's important for us not to just do the right thing. It's also important for us to know why we do the right thing. You know, if we're doing the right thing because we've always done it that way, I guess that's okay in a certain sense. It's even better if we understand why we are carrying out our worship in our lives the way that we do. You know, this has not been a lesson that's necessarily focused on calling you to respond in any sort of way. But maybe there are some things in your life that you realize, I don't know that I have been living my life the way that God has authorized me to live it. Maybe there are some things that you have been doing that you say, this is not in line with the truth of God's Word. If that is the case, we're going to have an invitation song. Caleb is going to lead it for us. We'd love to help you. We'd love to pray with you. If you have any need, why don't you come while we stand and while we sing.
Soldiers of Christ.